Pictou Island, Nova Scotia, is so isolated that even today it still doesn't have electricity. It once hosted a theater production, though, albeit in the most dramatic of possible circumstances. After a comedy troupe ship had gotten stuck in the ice, they had trudged to the island to seek shelter. The newspapers out west told the story as a brutal battle of men and women versus nature fighting for their lives. But, according to the Maritimers who were actually there, the events weren't so bad, and actually they were a pretty good time.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
As the storm clouds gathered on February 25th, 1907, passengers boarded the Stanley, a winter ferry departing Georgetown on Western PEI, bound for Charlottetown. This was not supposed to be a particularly long or especially difficult journey. They were just following the coast from Western PEI over to Charlottetown. Why didn't they drive, you may ask? Well, we actually did an episode that kind of covers that called When PEI Banned Cars. 40 passengers climbing onto the ship made up a remarkably diverse group with very little in common. These included the Abequate hockey team. This included the Jer McAuliffe Comedy Company. This included numerous lumberjacks. And this included 6 young ladies. Just as the ferry set off, a fierce winter storm blew in. Comedy Company member Colonel Willard G. Stanton later did an interview with the Moncton Transcript newspaper about the events, in which he recalled,
"There was such a gale blowing that we could only see a few yards from the steamer.
It had been an unusually long and cold winter. Much of the Northumberland Strait was frozen. The Stanley was blown badly off course, soon finding itself trapped in the ice. Surrounded by piles of ice, the ferry, which had been planning on following PEI's coastline as it made its way from one part of the island to the capital, instead drifted off into the Northumberland Strait. Unable to move and packed in ice, it drifted wildly off course across the strait towards Nova Scotia. When the dawn's light broke the next day and they surveyed the scene, the captain was horrified. The ice had piled up so high that it had, according to the Halifax Evening Mail newspaper,
almost laid her on her beam ends, breaking all the rail on the port side. The situation became serious.
The saga would later capture headlines from Ontario to British Columbia. There, newspapers reported the tale as a desperate battle of men and women in a horrific situation fighting for their lives. They rather dramatically compared it to the then recent disastrous voyage of Norwegian explorer Dr. Fridtjof Nansen, who had gotten stuck in the Arctic for 3 years. This, however, seemed to be laying it on a little bit thick. These Western newspapers also reported that these events had occurred in New Brunswick. They, of course, had not taken place particularly close to New Brunswick, and they'd actually taken place in PEI, and then on an island in Nova Scotia that's close to New Glasgow, suggesting these newspapers didn't know much about the Maritimes' geography, let alone how its people deal with crises. Those who were actually there told a very different tale. The plucky Maritimers were totally unfazed by the ice piling up over the boat. Colonel Stanton recounted that.
Some got skates from their trunks, were playing hockey and having a good time generally on the ice.
The passengers set up a makeshift bar.
We had a great time.
The ice showed no sign of relenting, and they had to spend Monday night on the ship. Tuesday rolled around, and they were still stuck.
We got a gramophone working, and afterwards got one of the crew up with a violin. We were dancing until midnight. We had races on the deck, up one side, down the other. Even the ladies participated.
A third day stuck on the ship, trapped in ice, dawned. To entertain themselves, the comedy troupe organized a mock trial, with all the passengers participating in this makeshift production.
It was comical to see some of the rigs the passengers got up for the occasion.
Then things got bad. The ice began to move in, squeezing the ship. It looked like the Stanley would be crushed between sheets of ice. Several miles off in the distance, they could see Pictou Island. It was, according to the St. John Evening Telegraph newspaper,
About 2 miles long and 100 yards wide. About 20 families live there, and it is not likely that the accommodations were at all adequate for the sudden influx of population.
they would have to make a perilous crossing of the Northumberland Strait to reach safety. They stripped the beds of all of their sheets and blankets. They piled them high atop the young ladies, who then got into the ship's rowboat with any valuables that were on the ship. The lumberjacks, the hockey team, and the comedians then dragged the boat 5 miles over rough and jagged ice to reach the safety of the island. It took them 6 hours to make it to firm land. Colonel Stanton recalled that.
It was a hard tramp over ice floes that would make your snowbanks look like bunkers on the golf links.
The comedy troupe managed to maintain their sense of humor, though, deciding that their precarious ice crossing reminded them of the vivid scene in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, where the slave, Eliza, escapes with her baby from her captors and their dogs by hopping from block of ice to block of ice until she reached safety.
If I were to put on Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's not a man or woman in the company who would not be able to play with startling realism the role of Eliza. That is, I'll accept myself. I had mine. Well, on the way from the Stanley to Pictou Island, I fell down one side of the ice sheets into the raging main and came up on the other side of another one. I was mixed in with the scenery for a few anxious moments, I can tell you.
As the curious convoy crossed the ice, they were spotted by the people of Pictou Island. By the time they made it to the shore, they were
Welcomed by a number of families who provided hot food and shelter for them.
wrote the Evening Telegraph. They ended up spending the next 7 days and 7 nights on little Pictou Island in the company of the local families, most of whom fished for a living. To thank the locals for their generosity and hospitality, the comedy troupe decided to put on a show. Never before had any kind of theatrical performance been held on Pictou Island. There was no community center, let alone an actual theater on Pictou Island, so the performance would be held in the island's only public space, which was the post office. The comedians had left all of their costumes, their props, and their scenery aboard the Stanley, so, much to their chagrin, they had to perform in their street clothes. On the Monday, a full week since their ship had first gotten stuck, the performers gave what the Moncton transcript called
The first ever theatrical performance ever given on Pictou Island.
Several of the hockey players and the lumberjacks were missing from the comedians' performance, though. Not seeing any sign that anyone had noticed they were missing, they set off to walk back to the Nova Scotian mainland by themselves to tell people what had happened. Finally, 2 days later, on March the 10th, an icebreaker arrived to collect the marooned passengers from Pictou Island. Colonel Stanton praised the comedians for braving the treacherous frozen waters, reminding readers that normally actors
Don't care too much about ice, unless it's in Champagne.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.